Throughout human history, people have dealt with various pandemics that in some way affected the overall destiny of humanity. Let's look at 10 of most dangerous ones we know about today. The Antonine Plague happened in the years 165 to 180, and 251 to 266. It affected 5 to 10 million people. The Antonine Plague, named after the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or the Plague of Galen, named after the doctor who talked about its symptoms, was likely smallpox. Galen described these symptoms: fever, feeling very thirsty, a swollen throat and cough, a rash all over the body, and vomiting with dark diarrhea, which meant bleeding in the stomach. But not everyone who got sick died. Those who lived through it became immune and didn't get sick again. The Roman army, coming back from the Middle East in around 165 to 166, likely brought the sickness with them. They got infected during the siege of Seleucia, a big city by the Tigris River. On their journey back, they passed on the sickness to others in the empire. It caused big problems in villages and cities, and Rome was hit hard. Every day, when you went out of the city, you could see carts carrying dead bodies. The sickness had some good effects. One good thing was making new laws about how people are buried. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus made a rule that says you can't build tombs in your own houses, and this rule still exists today. They also made rules against taking other people's graves because there wasn't enough space in cemeteries. Another good thing that came from the sickness is a book called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. In it, he talks about how to handle pain, sickness, worry, and loss using Stoic philosophy. This advice is still useful today. But overall, the deadly sickness made people less loyal and weakened their spirit. The Antonine Plague was the start of the end for the Roman Empire. Justinian's plague happened from 541 to 750. About 50 to 100 million people got sick, and many of them died. This was the first big outbreak of the bubonic plague in the world. It happened when Justinian was the emperor. Over 2 centuries, the disease came back a few times, and in total, about 50 million people died. That was about 26% of the world's population back then. The plague of Justinian started in Egypt and moved through Palestine. Then, it spread across the Mediterranean Sea to the Byzantine Empire, which was the remains of the old Rome led by Emperor Justinian. The sickness reached Constantinople in 542, almost a year after the first cases were reported in the outer areas of the empire. Like in other situations, black rats were mainly the reason the plague spread. These rats traveled in carts carrying grain sent to Constantinople as a gift. In the 8th century, North Africa was the main place where Byzantium got its grain. Unfortunately, this area was perfect for rats and fleas to multiply. The plague had a big impact on the empire. It messed up Emperor Justinian's plans to bring back the Roman Empire together. The price of grain went way up, and then it dropped suddenly. Historians think this caused a money problem, and the empire lost more than half of its land in the next 150 years. Leprosy in Europe in 11th century. Leprosy came to Europe about 1,600 years ago, and by the year 1050, it was widespread, affecting many people during the Middle Ages. Some experts think the Crusades in the 11th century brought the disease to Europe from Palestine, causing a major outbreak. Today, we call this disease Hansen's disease. In severe cases, leprosy can lead to problems like gangrene, blindness, changes in the nose, and issues with the bones. People had different reactions to the disease. Some thought leprosy was a punishment for wrongdoing that got passed down through families. This belief led to unkind treatment and exclusion of those with the disease. On the other hand, some saw the struggles of lepers as similar to the suffering of Christ. They believed that after enduring hard times on earth, lepers would go directly to heaven, getting closer to God. This belief led to more kindness and help for those affected by leprosy. To fight leprosy, many hospitals were made in Europe just for the sickness. Leper colonies were more like places to keep sick people away from others than hospitals. Using them a lot helped stop the disease from spreading more, and it basically ended the epidemic. In today's world, leprosy still affects many people each year, and it can be deadly if not treated with medicines. The first big progress in treating this sickness happened in the 1940s with a medicine called dapsone. Later, in the early 1960s, they found other medicines called rifampicin and clofazimine. Deadly sickness 1347 to 1350. 25 to 30 million people. A really bad sickness, called the Black Death, happened from 1347 to 1350. It killed about 1/3 of all the people in the world. Scientists say there are 3 kinds of this sickness, one that affects the body, one that affects the lungs, and one that affects the blood. All 3 kinds probably happened during the Black Death, but the one that affects the body was the most common. The thing that caused the sickness is the same for all 3 kinds. When people got sick, they had big lumps in their private areas and armpits. These lumps were called buboes, and that's why it's called the bubonic plague. The sick people also had black sores on their bodies from bleeding inside, so it's also called the Black Death. People with this illness also had a high fever and pain in their joints. If not treated, about 3 out of 4 people with bubonic plague would die within 3 days. The other 2 types of the plague, pneumonic and septicemic, would almost always lead to death. People think that the Black Death came to Europe in 1347. Before that, it hit the Golden Horde in Byzantium. It likely got to Sicily through sick rats on ships from Genoa. These ships came from Kaffa, a city on the Black Sea. Tatar Mongols were attacking Kaffa and threw sick bodies into the city. That's probably how Italians got the plague. Once it reached European cities, the plague quickly made them very deadly. In just a few months, lots of people died. Dead bodies were everywhere, some of them rotting on the streets and causing a really bad smell. In the 4th century in Europe, things were really bad even before the Black Death. There were problems with crops, famines in 1316 and 1317, and intense fights between European armies that led to the 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453. But the plague made things even worse for England and France. It was so serious that they had to make an agreement to stop fighting. Because of the epidemic, the traditional feudal systems fell apart. The way the economy worked and how many people lived in infected areas changed a lot. So many people died during the Black Death that it had big effects on medieval society. There weren't enough farmers, so people started demanding the end of serfdom, which made those in power worried about their control. On the upside, the lack of workers pushed for new inventions. During the plague, they came up with the spinning wheel and printing press, and windmills and watermills became more common. After that, there were more plague outbreaks in Europe. The biggest ones happened in the 17th to 18th centuries and the first half of the 20th century. Columbus Exchange, 1492 to 1520. 56 million people. The Columbus Exchange happened during the 15th to 16th centuries. It's when many plants, animals, technologies, and diseases moved between the New World and the Old World. These new diseases really hurt the Indians who hadn't faced them before. Between 80% and 95% of the Native American people in America died from sicknesses in the 100 to 150 years after Christopher Columbus found this land. The most dangerous illnesses from the Eastern Hemisphere that affected America were smallpox, measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, bubonic plague, typhoid fever, and malaria. When Columbus reached the island of Hispaniola on December 5, 1492, he met the Taino people. At that time, there were around 60,000 Taino. However, by 1548, which is 56 years later, their numbers had dropped to less than 500. This same situation happened in other parts of America. In 1520, the Aztec Empire was wiped out by a disease called smallpox. The Aztecs were already weak from the illness, and they couldn't fight against the colonizers. In the later years, the native people in America still faced sicknesses brought by Europeans. A well-known example is when Indians were purposely given smallpox during Pontiac's Rebellion. Between 1763 and 1766, Native Americans in the Great Lakes area rebelled against the British colonial rules because they were unhappy. While besieging one of the forts, the British gave blankets carrying smallpox to the opposing side. This event marked the first use of biological weapons in history. A study from 2019 found that around 56 million Native Americans passed away in the 16th and 17th centuries, mainly because of diseases. This large loss of life might have affected the Earth's climate. As vegetation started growing on lands that were no longer cultivated by the native people, it absorbed more carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air, leading to cooling. First cholera outbreak, 1817 to 1824. No information available. The initial of 7 widespread cholera outbreaks, that affected the world for 150 years, started in the Ganges Delta, Jessore, India, in 1817. The Vibrio cholerae bacteria, which caused the disease, came from tainted rice. The illness rapidly moved through a significant part of India, present-day Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, and also extended along trade routes. In 1820, cholera spread to Thailand and Indonesia. About 100,000 people died in Java, and it also reached the Philippines. After that, it went to China in 1820, and Japan in 1822. Later, it spread to other parts of the world, moving beyond Asia. In 1821, soldiers from Britain going from India to Oman brought cholera to the Persian Gulf. The sickness later went to places like Turkey, Syria, and southern Russia. The British ships carried cholera to Europe and America, starting in Spain and Italy, and then reaching Germany. Around 6 years later, the first cholera outbreak calmed down. Historians think one reason for this was the really cold winter from 1823 to 1824, which might have killed the bacteria and cleaned up the dirty water. A vaccine for the sickness was made much later, in 1892. Spanish flu, from 1918 to 1919. Over 50 million people. The well-known Spanish flu was a sickness caused by the H1N1 virus, which came from birds. It got its name because the first big outbreak, announced by telegraph services in the spring of 1918, happened in Madrid. The Spanish flu started in Europe, the USA, and some Asian countries, and then it spread worldwide. Back in the early 1900s, there weren't any good medicines or vaccines to treat a dangerous type of flu. Around 500 million people got sick with this virus in just 2 years, which was 1/3 of the world's population at that time. The Spanish flu was a big problem because the flu virus changed a lot. It had a serious mutation called an antigenic shift. One of the virus's proteins, which makes it harmful, changed, and basically, the flu virus became new for people's immune systems. So, everyone was vulnerable to it. That's why there were so many cases of the illness, leading to a worldwide outbreak and a lot of people getting sick and dying. During this pandemic, something unusual happened. A lot of healthy young people, aged 20 to 40, were dying. The only way to get rid of the sickness was by letting it run its course. The number of cases started going down a lot in the summer of 1919 because some of the sick people passed away, and the ones who survived became immune. The Spanish flu outbreak made people come up with a plan to deal with it. In 1918, they started using measures like lockdowns, keeping a distance from others, not allowing big gatherings, wearing masks, and other ways to prevent the spread of the sickness. This was the first time these methods were used on a large scale. HIV/AIDS from 1981, present days. More than 35 million people. Discovered in 1981, the AIDS virus can't be cured. In the worst situation, the HIV virus damages the immune system, which can result in death from other diseases like infections or cancer. Signs of HIV when it gets worse include fever, headache, and swollen lymph nodes. AIDS is the final stage of HIV infection, and it takes about 10 to 15 years from being infected with HIV to reach this stage. HIV spreads only through blood and sexual contact. Often, there are no symptoms when someone is infected, and an HIV test is needed to check for the presence of the infection. HIV, a changed form of a virus found in chimpanzees, is thought to have appeared around the 1920s in West Africa. It then moved to Haiti in the 1960s and from there to New York and San Francisco in the 1970s. Even though the virus started spreading much earlier, doctors first identified it in the 1980s within American gay communities. Currently, several effective medications and treatments have been developed that can slow down the progress of HIV. Additionally, there are 2 documented cases where individuals were cured of HIV. Both patients received donor bone marrow transplants. Atypical pneumonia or SARS. From 2002 to 2003. 774 people severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, caused by the SARS-CoV virus, was first recognized in 2003, a few months after the outbreak started. Similar to COVID-19, the virus originally came from bats, then passed to cats, and eventually became harmful to humans. SARS shows symptoms similar to regular flu infections: dry cough, fever, headache, and body aches. Compared to COVID-19, there were some positive aspects in dealing with the SARS epidemic. First, the virus causing SARS seemed to have a lower rate of spreading than SARS-CoV-2. Second, the symptoms did not involve a runny nose and sneezing, which usually make it easier for the virus to pass from person to person. Third, timely and effective quarantine measures were put in place, thanks to Dr. Carlo Urbani, who organized steps that greatly restricted the spread of SARS. Unfortunately, he tragically lost his life in the process. Even though the cases were relatively concentrated, with a total of 8,096 infections in 26 countries worldwide and 774 deaths, the threat of this virus should not be taken lightly. Effective quarantine measures played a crucial role in controlling the spread of SARS. The lessons learned from dealing with SARS have been applied to some extent to contain other diseases like H1N1 influenza, Ebola, and Zika virus disease. COVID-19. From 2020, present days. COVID-19 has affected the world since 2020, causing a surprise for everyone. The virus, known as SARS-CoV-2, has led to a pandemic, with over 5 million people dying by November 2021. Despite efforts like quarantine and vaccines, the virus remains a threat. Treating the severe pneumonia it causes requires medicines like steroids, blood thinners, and oxygen therapy. The world's healthcare systems weren't ready for this unexpected challenge. Moreover, this virus has a post-COVID syndrome, showing symptoms like headaches, weakness, loss of smell, high blood pressure, stomach issues, and cognitive problems. Worldwide, doctors are battling the 4th wave of the epidemic, strongly encouraging people to get vaccinated. This helps to slow down the spread and better resist new strains of the virus. Dealing with known infections is more straightforward. The extent of their spread relies on how easily they can be transmitted and the method of transmission. Infections passed through close contact at home are easier to manage compared to those spread through airborne droplets. The challenge arises when a new and unfamiliar pathogen emerges, as was the case with COVID-19. The coronavirus pandemic has acted as a catalyst for changes in the economy and social aspects. It has sped up processes, serving as a great accelerator. This includes the shift toward digitalization and changes in perspectives on movement, working hours, physical interactions, personal health, and other fundamental aspects of our systems. The full impact of these changes is still to be evaluated. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel.